We are really happy to be presenting this paper to sort of make sure that older adults are on the agenda. It is true our paper is on people 45 to 65, and the older I get, the less that seems like older adults, but that is the way things are defined. Actually, in gerontology, we do often ask people, well, when do you think someone is old? And on average, we say that someone is old when they're about 15 years older than we are. That does seem about right. So it is a pleasure to add older adults to this incredibly important agenda of lifelong learning and adult education. So with every opportunity, of course, come challenges, and one of my personal challenges is that my colleague, Phyllis Cummins, who is the first author of this paper, was not able to be here because of a last-minute circumstance, but the good news is Phyllis is here by phone, and so that is really a comfort to me. Earlier this morning with the introductory comments, we heard about the importance of these deep dives into the PIAAC data, and I will have to say that Phyllis on our team is the one with the scuba gear doing the deep diving, so I'm really glad she's here to help answer some of the questions that you may have. Our other challenge is the same as every other presenter, that our paper is much longer and much more detailed than our presentation can possibly be. So we did have to make some choices, but we did make those choices. Okay, there we go. So as with everyone else's presentation, we're going to start with a description of the research, some key findings, and then just a few slides on what we see as possibilities and our wish list for future research, as well as implications for policy and practice. Excuse me. So the title of this slide talks about the importance of adult education and training research, but I want to emphasize again the importance of older adults being included in this research. So it is about adult education and training, but it's specifically about the aging population. I think we've talked a little bit already about how investments in human capital are increasingly important in this globalized and rapidly changing economy, with job skills needing to be upgraded very regularly. And again, with older adults becoming an increasingly important part of the labor force. So I'm going to show you a slide in a minute about the aging of the U.S. labor force. I also want to point out that people are remaining in the labor force longer than ever before. And actually, I want to acknowledge that I'm so happy that I have some gerontologist colleagues in the audience who can also add to some of this information. But people, either because of need or because of desire, or sometimes both, are staying in the workforce longer. We cannot ignore the demographics of our society in acknowledging that older workers are going to become increasingly important for economic growth. Older workers are given the aging of the baby boom, older workers are just a segment of our society that are a valuable asset, and we need ways to capitalize on those resources as well as on individual opportunities. But the bottom line is, we know that older workers sometimes have a fear of returning to the classroom. They sometimes have a fear of everything related to education. They sometimes need help with with computer skills, and so they're similar to other populations that we're trying to serve with these programs and services. So here's a slide, and being a member of Table 8 in the back, I've suffered from not being able to see the slides. I don't know how easy or hard this one is to see, but this just demonstrates again the importance of the aging population in the shape of our workforce, the age structure of our workforce. So these are projections, or counts, and then projections from 1992 to 2022. The light green bar on the far right shows the proportion of the labor force that is 45 and older, and you can see that that share is growing considerably and will continue to grow considerably. But I also think it's important to point out that the composition of that 45-plus segment of the labor force is also changing. So by 2022, we're going to see significant increases in the proportion of the labor force that are 55 to 64. That's the red bar. And the proportion that are 65 plus. Again, attesting to the fact that people are staying in the workforce longer, and because of the aging of our society, the labor force itself is also aging. And of course, this is all largely attributable to us good old baby boomers. And I can tell you that at Miami University, teaching 18 and 19-year-olds about aging and the importance of the baby boomers, they often say, we are so sick of hearing about the baby boomers. And here's my answer, too bad. We're a fact of your life. So the purpose of this research, and let me again express my appreciation that Phyllis is on the phone, and about halfway through I'm going to ask Phyllis if she has any corrections or additions to what I've been saying. But the purpose of the research is really to look at, we're looking at a different set of variables than we've heard about so far. So we want to know about the relationship or association between participation in formal and non-formal adult education and training programs and labor market outcomes for people 45 to 65. And those labor market outcomes that we're looking at are employment status, employed or unemployed, labor force status, in the labor force, not in the labor force, and income, some measures of income. And we looked specifically at income quintiles and some measures of net worth from another data set. Our specific research questions look at these exact, a reflection of what that purpose is, that what is the relationship between labor force participation and employment and AET participation, income and net worth. But then, and I need to point out here that we looked at US data in a little bit more detail, but we also looked at some data from other countries and made some comparisons. So we did, I think what some of the other papers have done, also looked at some US data, but then put it in context of some country comparisons. And you'll see those countries in just a minute. But we also looked at the literature on the characteristics of AET programs in other countries. How are they funded? What's the culture surrounding lifelong learning or adult education? What incentives are there for employees and employers and employees to participate and to offer AET programs? And then last, we put the US findings in context. So some of our, again, as most of the preceding papers, some of our findings are descriptive. For some of the questions, we used either binary logistic regression, when the outcome was either in the labor force or not, or employed or not. And then we used ordinal logistic regression for income quintiles. Again, we're not going to be able to go into detail about all of the findings, but I hope we've chosen ones that will pique your interest and further the conversation. So here's some key findings from the first set of analyses, looking at participation in adult education and training programs. And you're going to see that there is a country variation considerably. And then we're going to look at some findings about who's most likely, what is the association between employment and labor force involvement and participation in these programs. And I want to say at this point, the reviewers for our paper were fantastic, and it improved our paper enormously. And one of the things that I've become especially cautious about is not implying causality. The participation in AET question, it was, in the last 12 months, did you participate in any of these different kinds of AET programs? So we have what they said about their participation over the past 12 months, and then we know whether they're employed or not, or in the labor force or not. So we can't imply or assume any sort of time ordering or causal direction, but we do a lot of applied evaluation research at the Scripps Gerontology Center, so we're really used to talking about interventions and outcomes, so I apologize if I slip into that language inappropriately. Okay. So the first 3 bullet points on this slide sort of summarize the results we're going to see on the bar charts, that the differences among countries about the rates of participation in AET, but then also the fact that people not employed and not in the labor force are not as likely to participate in those programs. And then these last 2 questions are speculations that we're going to return to. Like what explains that association, and what, as we look forward to future research, what might we be looking for in terms of the the potential effectiveness of adult education and training programs for older workers. Excuse me. So on this slide you can see that Sweden has indeed the highest rate of participation in AET programs. Actually the U.S. sort of takes the lead for the 55 to 65 group, but not by much. But Sweden has overall a very high rate of participation. And this is where some of the work that we did looking at, well, what's the policy environment, what's the culture about lifelong learning in these countries. And Sweden indeed has a very well established, very well funded program for lifelong learning and a philosophy of second chance, where there are routes provided for higher education, especially for underrepresented groups and disadvantaged groups. So it is very much a culture that supports participation in adult education and training programs. So these programs are widely offered. There are incentives for employers to offer these programs to their employees, so that may help explain some of that difference. All right, now here we're looking at the 45 to 54-year-old group, and I think this slide is a good example of the richness of this data and the complexity of the questions that can arise from looking deeply at some of these patterns. So the overall pattern that we look at here, this is comparing employed and unemployed persons. So the red bar is participation for people who are employed. The blue bar is for people who are unemployed. So the overall pattern is that people who are employed are more likely to have participated in an AET program in the past 12 months. That is perhaps not surprising, but I think we can, again, speculate and think about further research questions. But I think it's also important to note the country differences in the two proportions. So if you look at the U.S., there's a big gap between participation in AET between employed and unemployed people. That gap is not nearly as wide in other countries. So I think that's an interesting topic for further research. So this is participation by labor force status, either in the labor force or not. And again, we see similar pattern overall, that for all of the countries included in our analysis, people who are in the labor force are much more likely, they're the red bar, are much more likely to have participated in an AET program in the past 12 months than those who are not in the labor force. But again, there's some very interesting country discrepancies. And here again, and this is the last time I'm going to mention, I do want to point out that, you know, we're looking at basically a relationship between two variables. So is it the case that participating in AET increases the likelihood that you're going to be in the labor force, remain in the labor force, or is it the case that if you're in the labor force, you're more likely to participate in an AET program? I think that's an incredibly important question that we can't tease out with the data that we have. This is the same question in the labor force, not in the labor force, for the older workers, and this becomes an interesting variation on the question because of the opportunity for uptake of Social Security benefits at age 62. So this picture might have looked different, but in fact the pattern looks very much the same as it does for the 45 to 54-year-old workers. Again, the same kind of discrepancy. All right, so now we're looking at some of the findings about income and patterns of relationship between AET participation and income quintiles. The bottom line is lower income quintiles, people in those quintiles were least likely to have participated in AET programs compared to higher income quintiles. And when we looked, the regression results showed that the impact of participating in AET was not as significant. Being a woman was still a disadvantage in labor force outcomes, particularly income. Having less than a high school diploma also remains a disadvantage even when participation in AET is included in the regression models. And this pattern of lower participation by lower income groups was actually consistent across all of the countries that we looked at. And here's some slides to show you a little bit about that. So this shows for four of the 5 countries that we looked at, the percent who participated in AET. This is the 45 to 54-year-old group. And again, the red bar pardon me, represents the highest income quintile. The yellow bar is the average, and the blue bar is the lowest income quintile. And again, the pattern is the same. Perhaps the pattern is not surprising. Similar findings for the older age group, the 55 to 65-year-old groups, that those in the higher the income quintile, the most likely people were to participate, and that is true across, in this case, Sweden, the UK, US, and Japan. Okay, thank you. Well, that's about perfect. Thank you. Because we're on to, first of all, Phyllis, is there any clarification or addition that you would like to make at this point? Well, okay.
No, you did a great job.
All right. Thank you. All right. Bless your heart. Thank you. All right. So what do we want to do in our future research agenda? Well, we are very interested actually in looking at, for older adults, aging adults, older workers, the relationship between AET participation and the skills variables that many of you have talked about. We would also like to include, and with the bigger data set, we will include a look at people who are post-retirement, because this is just a fact of life these days in the U.S. and in many countries, continued involvement in the labor force past the traditional retirement age. And in many ways, that's such a good thing. Gerontologists talk about the life course and the stages of the life course, and it used to be that we thought about the life course having 3 distinct phases: education, work, retirement, and that is simply not the case. And the more we can depart from that model and look at transitions between each of those activities, the better off we're all going to be. So it's a really promising time to look at the changes of aging. All right, so we do want to understand a little bit more about people who are unemployed. One of our great interests is older workers who become unemployed and seek to become reemployed. And we're also looking at including other data sets so that we can look at cohort changes over time, similar to the suggestion earlier about looking at trends for women and numeracy skills over time, where we want to look at what's happening with cohorts as they age and cohorts who were older adults at different points in time. And last, we think that our findings provide preliminary support for some policy and practices, that low-cost opportunities are going to be really important. When the PIAAC data also included questions about if you didn't participate, why didn't you participate? And the most common answers were, I'm too busy, it's too expensive, I'm too busy with family obligations. There's variation in who gave what answer. The lower income quintiles were more likely to say it's too expensive. But these are really, I think, they have direct implications for policy and practice. We are also really interested in outreach to unemployed older workers and those not in the labor force to sort of bring them into the system. Out of time. Thank you very much. Thank you for your support. And I thought I had 40 minutes.